So we're going to talk about infrastructure as code using Azure Bicep. And I'm not sure if any of you have heard of Azure Bicep, but this is a really good tool for creating infrastructure in Azure. All right, so what is Azure Bicep? So the main thing about Azure Bicep is it's a domain-specific language. And what that means is it's a language that was specifically created for one purpose, and that is to deploy and create infrastructure within Azure. So if anybody's familiar with ARM templates, you know that ARM templates are very difficult to write and to read. It's JSON, it's pure JSON. And even though some people say it's a declarative language, it's really not. It's just incredibly complicated. So what Azure Bicep does is it introduces a declarative language for creating infrastructure. And it's much easier to write. It's much easier to read. And it gets you there a lot faster. It really abstracts a lot of the details that you would have to write if you're writing an ARM template. You know, ARM templates, it's almost impossible to write ARM templates from scratch. You always have to copy and paste something that's already been created and tweak it. Whereas with ARM, if you know what you want to write and you want to create, you can do it from scratch, and it's really easy to do. So when you have a Bicep file, what you do when you compile it is it compiles to a ARM template, a JSON ARM template. And that allows you to deploy it like an ARM template. Though when you do create a Bicep file, it's not an ARM template. It's, like I said, a DSL. And you have the full benefits in Visual Studio Code of Intellisense and all the great instant feedback of whether something is syntactically correct or not. And that gives you a lot of insight in what you're doing while you're writing these things. Whereas with ARM templates, you really don't know until you actually try to run it. And so that's you would like to know it a little bit earlier than that, whether it's going to work or not. So the goals of Azure Bicep is to create that abstraction, to remove the complexity that you have with ARM templates. It really is an answer to tools or languages like Terraform, which is a YAML type of structure that is pretty easy to write to. And it abstracts a lot of the details away. Whereas Bicep is more of a Python type language, and it's really elegant. So you don't need to know all those inner details of how to syntactically write an ARM template when you're writing Bicep. Of course, you need to know how to create infrastructure and the things that go into creating a resource within Azure and what the things you need to set. But once you know that, it's very easy to write. And it's also very easy to learn. Like I said, you could take an ARM template and easily recreate it in Bicep, not only manually, but you can run commands like bicep decompile, which will take a ARM template and turn it into a Bicep file. Another great thing with a Bicep is you can take a modular approach and reuse things. So if you have a VNet that you want to create, you can make that a module, and you can use that code and reuse that code by pointing to the module in any of your other Bicep templates, so that if you need to make a change to it, you make the change in one place rather than having to go to every single Bicep file that you're using that type of resource and make the changes. So it's like I said, it's a very easy tool to use. You can run it locally. You can run it as far as pipelines in Azure Pipelines or GitHub Actions. And you have the ability to use these things in pipelines to get that full automation. Whereas, with Terraform, you can do all those things, but with Terraform, you have this dependency on a state file. And what a state file is it's the definition of what's already out there in Azure. And it looks at that state file rather than what what's actually in Azure at the time. So if that state file is out of sync with what's in Azure, it's going to fail. Whereas with Bicep, just like with ARM templates, it goes and looks at what's already in Azure with the resources that have been created and what their configuration is, and it does the compare. So you don't have to worry about a state file. All right, let's get to it then. All right. So what we're going to do here is something pretty easy. We're going to create we have a Bicep file here that doesn't have anything in it, but and we're going to create a web app in Azure, something simple. And I'll talk about, I'll write this out, and then we'll turn it into something that's a module, so you can see that. And then we'll go over to pipelines if we have time. And we'll go and see how it works in an automated way within a pipeline. So in order to set up your environment, you need to actually install Bicep. So the first thing you need to do is install AZCLI. And then AZCLI, you can then install Bicep. So if you do, let's see if this works, like AZ Bicep version. It should give you the version that you have within it's installed. Now, installing Bicep here, see it's 0.4, and you can, what it will do is when you do something like AZ Bicep install, once you have AZCLI installed, then it will install Bicep, but it will make it available within Visual Studio Code. If you want to use it in PowerShell too, the paths are not set up correctly, so you need to install Bicep as an executable in order to get the path to work. So that's how you can set up your environment, and you also have extensions for Visual Studio Code that will allow you to get that great CLI or that great Intellisense type of effect. So one of the things that we do when we're creating an ARM template is we have to have parameters, because we need to be able to pass in what's needed in order to run it. So for a web app, oops, in the wrong place. For a web app, we need, of course, the name of the site, the web app. So the parameter structure here is the name of the parameter and the data type. And you see you have a couple of different choices here with Intellisense. So that makes it really helpful. Other things we need is the hosting plan. And that's also a string. So for creating a resource in Azure, you also have to tell it what the location is: East US, East US 2, West. So that's another parameter that we'll need. But the nice thing about this is that we can use Bicep functions in order to get this stuff automatically. So there's a resource group function, and you can type in resource group dot location. So when you're an ARM template by default is scoped to a resource group. So when you do a command with the default scoping of resource group, you're going to be passing in to the command that runs the Bicep what the location is going to be, because that's going to be critical. And you also pass in the name of the resource group as part of the command. So location we need here, but we're already going to know it because we passed it in the command to run the bicep file. Now, resource group is something that you would also pass in, but it's not necessarily needed for creating the resources here, because you're just telling it within the command where you want these resources to be created. It's not necessarily what the resources need in order to create. So another thing we need to know is the SKU. And we can default these things also. And what that means is you can either override this by passing in a value for SKU name, but if you don't pass that in as a parameter in your call, it's going to use the default value that you have here. So just like these two have default values. So we're not even going to pass in these two when we call when we run this. And another thing that we can do are tags. And tags in Bicep and in ARM templates are an object. So we have this object type here, and we can create the object pretty easily by just having a name value pair. We could say, what's the date today? 4th. So we could say 3/4/2022. And then, whatever the tags are. I'll just create one more. All right. So we have our parameters here. And this is everything we're going to need in order to create a simple web app within Azure. So the next things we need to do are define the resources. So the resources there's a special type called resource within Bicep. And you start off with Bicep with the resource name. And you also give it a name here. And what this allows you to do is reference this, what we're calling a service plan, the app service plan. We can reference that later on when we're creating the web app by just saying service plan dot whatever we need. So the other thing we need to do when we're creating this resource after we give it its name is we have to tell it what type of resource it's going to be. So you have all this Intellisense for doing that. So we could just type in something like server farm. This is the app service plan, and then it gives you the versions automatically in Intellisense. So we'll take the first one, and then you just do equal brackets. And this is where we can now go and create our resources. So we can see here, we have this little squiggly here telling us that we're missing some things. We're missing location and name that are required. So this is the great Intellisense stuff that you don't get when you're creating a JSON file. So the name is going to be this hosting plan name. You see here, it's a parameter that we created up at the top, and it's showing up in Intellisense. And location, we're going to tell it to do or use that parameter. So look what happens if you see that the squigglies have gone away. It also gives you Intellisense if you say, I don't want to use a parameter, I just want to use this, because this would work. But you see you have this little squiggly here, and it gives you information. Use a parameter here instead of resourcegroup.location, because it should only be used as default value for a parameter. So this is something that will show up as a warning too when you run the Bicep file. So it gives you ideas of how to make this thing work better so you have a more predictable result. All right, so we have the name, and this name right here is just the deployment name in Azure when you run the Bicep file to deploy it. In Azure, in the resource group, you'll see the deployment section at the top right, and this gives it its name. So other things that we need to do is do the SKU. And you can see here we have further Intellisense. And we're going to give it its SKU name. And the last thing that we're going to need for the app service plan are the tags. So tags can use that object. So right here is where we have our app service plan fully created. And it also tells you up here that you're not using one of the parameters yet, which is the site name. Okay, so now that we have the app service plan, what we need to do is create the app service. So then once again, that's another resource. And we'll call this website. And we'll look at the Intellisense here for sites. And we'll use the latest API version. We'll do equals. Oh, another thing here is existing. So what existing will do is if you have an existing resource somewhere that you don't necessarily want to create, but you want to reference the properties and the metadata of that resource, you could do existing. And what it will do is it will bring into your Bicep file all the information for that existing resource so that you can use its properties in other resources, but it won't create the resource. It will just give you information about that resource. So that's really nice too, to have that existing. Okay, so here we need a lot of the things that we needed above. We need a location and we need name. So the name here is going to be the name of the app service. So that's the site name parameter up here. And then we need location. Where is this going to be created? And we still need some properties. So if you look at an ARM template, you definitely know what the structure is going to be that you would need in Bicep. You can easily just follow an existing ARM template if you wanted to and create it as a Bicep file if you wanted to do it manually like that. But we need to set our properties here. And what we need is the app service plan. And that's all we're going to do. There are a lot of other properties you could set, dozens of properties you could set on an app service, but for our purposes, we're just going to go the least wordy way of doing it. So the hosting plan is what the service form ID is. We could also do something like this, since we have it set up here. We could do service plan dot name. And what this will do is it uses the values that were created up here, but it also creates the order of execution for you. So normally it will go from top to bottom, but that isn't always how it would be. So by saying that you're going to use ServicePlan.name here, it's going to put, in an ARM template sense, it's going to put a depends on to this. So if we were going to decompile this as an ARM template, or I should say build it, not decompile, we'll see what that looks like. So bicep build main.bicep. Okay, so we have our JSON file right here. And you can see this is what we just wrote in Bicep as an ARM template. So we have our parameters. We have our service farm here. And we also have our server farm ID, which even though we told it to use the resource of the app service plan to get the name, it still was able to figure out that it's a parameter. But the other thing is it put this depends on in there, saying that it is reliant before this can run. This the one above, the hosting plan, needs to be created first. All right, let me just get rid of that. All right, so we have our bicep file here, and now we want to run it. So locally, we can run it either by turning it into an ARM template and doing an ARM template deploy. But in PowerShell, AZ PowerShell, we have this ability to, I'll make that a lot bigger. I'm going to get rid of the stuff on the right. Is that good? So right here, we have a new AZ resource group deployment commit. And what we're doing is we're pointing it to a bicep file. We're not even pointing it to a JSON file. We're just telling it what the bicep file is. We're passing in the resource group name. And then the parameters that we're passing in are the site name and the hosting plan name. So when we go to run this, it's going to know what to do. So let's just do this and run it, and hopefully it works. So this takes a little while to run. And while that's running, we can go and look at what's going on in Azure. So if we refresh this, it should be showing that deployments are running. So let's go and make sure that this is actually doing something. So we have Philly.net 2022 as the resource group name, and it says it succeeded. So that was quick. So sometimes it takes a little while for it to show up. So we'll wait a minute or two. So I'm also interested in this deployment section here. So these two things ran today. So that was very, very fast. So now we have both of our resources here, just from running it locally within Azure or within PowerShell. All right, so I'm going to delete this because if we have time, I'm going to create the same thing using a pipeline. All right, so the next thing I want to show you is the ability to modularize, create a module for what we just did. All right, so we have all of this code here. And what we're going to want to do is copy this. So we want to make a module. And I'm going to paste it in the same folder. And I'm going to rename it. And let's just call it web app. Bicep. Okay, so this is going to be our module. And you notice we're not going to make any changes to this. We're going to use it as is, but we're going to make the changes over here within our main bicep file. So what this main bicep file is going to do is it's going to use the module that we created. But we're going to do something a little bit different here. When I said before that the by default ARM templates are scoped towards resource groups, it doesn't have to be. You could scope it to a subscription, a management group. You can scope it to different types of things. So we're going to use a designation called target scope, and we're going to tell it what the scope is going to be. So you can see here, these are the different scopes you can have: management group, resource group, subscription, and tenant. We're going to do subscription. And why are we doing this? Because I'm going to show you how we can create not only resources within a resource group, we can also create the resource group as part of our bicep definition. So we're going to need a couple parameters here that are not defaulted, and call this resource group name, and this will be a string. And we are going to create the location for the resource group. So we're going to need a parameter for that. and this is also a string, but here we're going to default it. So as I said, we know what the scope is. We know it's going to be a subscription scope, but we're going to specify what the location is when we are running this in PowerShell. Since it is a subscription level resource or bicep file, when we call it using a different command that we used previously in PowerShell, we're going to have to pass in the location rather than having it be a parameter you could set. So we could use deployment.location as a way to figure out what the location is at the calling level within PowerShell. All right, so we have the two parameters that we're going to need. So now we're going to create a resource for the resource group. We'll call this RG, and we'll just type in resource groups in order to get the Intellisense. And we'll use the latest API version. And here, we're going to give it its name. And that's going to be the resource group name. And we're going to also give it the location. And we're going to use the resource group location parameter for that. Okay, so that's very simple. You really don't need anything else other than tags when you create a resource group. But we're not going to use tags. If anybody is familiar with creating resources, tags are probably the most difficult thing about being able to set up the tags and especially setting it up in an automated pipeline. You could set it as an object, which means you have a string that you do as a variable, or you can have them as individual parameters, which means you can have a lot of different parameters if you have a lot of tags. All right, so now what we're going to do, instead of writing the code here like we did before for the resources of the AppService plan and the web app, we're going to use the module that we created here. So we're going to use something called module. This is a module, and we're going to name it. And we're going to tell it where our module is. And it gives you the Intellisense of whatever's in your folder. So the other syntax is exactly the same. So this just shows you how easy this is. We want to give it a name. It's like we have to give everything a name. And we'll call this Billy.net 2022 app instead. And we're going to tell it what the scope is. Since our bicep file here is in a scope of subscription, we now have to tell it at the module level that we're now at the resource group scope, because otherwise it will run at the subscription scope and we wouldn't be able to deploy to a resource group if we're at the subscription scope. So we use the scope, and we're going to tell it what is the scope of our resource group, or what is the resource group that we're going to be using, I should say. So we could say resource group, and then here we could tell it what the resource group name is. So we're going to use this and get the name from the previous one, the previous resource we created. So rg.name. So this is telling us when we deploy our app service, we are going to deploy it to this resource group that was created up here. And this way it knows that we are now scoped not only to a resource group, but what the resource group is. So we're going to need to pass in params. And the params that we need are the site name. Now you see you got Intellisense there because it knows what the module is. And we'll call this, we're just going to hard code this in here instead of having it a parameter. Billy.net app 2022, let's say new. that in quotes. Everything's a single quote. And then the other thing we need is the hosting plan. So these are the parameters that we have here. Hosting plan name. We could have made this. We could have made these parameters, and we probably should, but we're not in this case. And now we're going to tell it what the location is. You see, we still have squigglies here, which means we have not filled the requirements of using the module yet as far as parameters are concerned. We have this location, and we're going to tell it to use the resource group location above. All right, so if we compile this and we build it, we can see what this will look like using the module. All right, so we have this JSON file, and we can see here that we have, it's a lot more complicated. We have our parameter list, and we have our resources. So this resource is the resource group that we're creating, and this is scoped to the subscription. Now, since we need to do something within a resource group itself, we need to set this up as a deployment section because now we're changing the scope. And we can see here, we have the scope as inner, which means that we are now within our own scope separate from the overall scope of the ARM template. If we said outer here, we would take the scope of the ARM template. So here we're just saying that this is now a scope within this deployment type. So we have our parameters within our scope right here and here. We're passing in the location. And then here's where we get the details of what we're doing. So we have parameters at the deployment level. And now we have to do the parameters at the actual resource definition level. So we have our parameters that we're passing in automatically. And it's now creating the resources right here. So you get the idea that this is far more complicated doing it this way with an ARM template than it is in Bicep. So let me just get rid of this again. All right, so now we're back here at our main.bicep, and now we're going to want to run this. So let's go back to our PowerShell and look at the second command that we have here. And we're going to notice here that we have this, in the first one, we did new AZ resource group deployment. And this one, we're now doing a new AZ subscription deployment because this is scoped at the subscription level rather than at the resource group level. So we're telling it which one to use, the template file, which is Bicep. We have to pass in the location, like I said, because this is now at a subscription scoped type of thing. So we have to tell it this is a required parameter you have to pass in, not a parameter that we specified. Just like up here, this was a required parameter that we had to pass in. We didn't necessarily specify it within the Bicep file. So this is a parameter, the name. And everything else, if we go look at the Bicep file, we have name, but the resource group location is using the default of the deployment right here. So we don't have to pass in that parameter. So let's run this. And let's see what happens. So while that's running, we'll go over to Azure. And you see we have this, the one that we've been working on here. Let's refresh and see if the other one's showing up. Not yet, but it should show up soon. Let's make sure nothing's erroring out here. So when it shows up is based on when it actually gets defined and gets synced up with your portal. Let's refresh again. Oh, so here we go. It just showed up. And it looks like it succeeded. Let's see if it succeeded here. Yep, it succeeded. You can see right here. And let's see when the app service plan comes. So here we go. So we were able to not only create our resources within a resource group, but we are able to create the resource group itself. So there's a whole lot of power here that we can use. But everything that we did here was local to our machine. That is not how we would do it in an enterprise production type of scenario. In a production type scenario, we would want to do this through an automated pipeline. So that is, this is good for testing. And not only are we running it locally, but we have to have permissions at the subscription and the resource group level in order to, at the Azure subscription and resource group level, in order for us to do this locally. So in companies, you're not always given those permissions to do that. So running it locally is good for development, but we can't run this locally for a QA test, UAT or prod environment, because we won't have the permissions. Good for the dev subscription, but nothing else. So we want to do this in a pipeline, where the pipeline is going to use a service connection that has contributor access to whatever scope it needs, whether it's a resource group or the the subscription. So let's go take a look at what this will look like as a pipeline. All right, so we have this this pipeline here that we created, and let's walk through it. So this is YAML. We're telling it it's not a trigger. We're specifying a resource here. So one thing that we're going to do is use templates, YAML templates, in order to do things that are repeatable. And building a bicep file is a repeatable thing. So we don't have to constantly be rewriting that code in every single pipeline. We can create a template for it. And this template contains all the details. So let's just move down here, and we'll get to this in a second. So once you tell it where that template is, which is the name of the name you're going to use in the repository, the type. If this were in GitHub, you would use GitHub here as the type, and also where that repo is, where the repository is. So we're saying it's in the IAC team project, and it's in this repository. So now we have variables that we need to set, and these variables right here are basically just for running the pipeline. This is like the build stuff, the configuration, if we were going to do a build, the image that we're going to be using, the build job display name, the path to the bicep file. So those things we need. And here is where we have the deployment stuff. So we could have a dev stage, a test stage, a QA stage, all the way up through prod. But we're going to have to tell it what its configurations are. So we just have a dev stage here, and this dev stage is going to specify a couple things. One is the environment that we're going to be using, and what the environment is, if we go here and duplicate, this is an environment within Azure Pipelines. And what this environment will do is be the container of where these deployments are going. So it will have a history of all the deployments that are been done to this environment, been deployed to this environment. This is a PaaS service, so that's all it does. If we had a VM or a Kubernetes cluster, we could actually add those resources here. So you would see where it's deploying, like the virtual machine names and all that kind of stuff. But since it's PaaS, it's really just a container, but it's still important because we can put approvals around this. And there are all kinds of approvals that we could do. Manual approvers are the ones that we would be doing most of the time, but there are a bunch of other ones that we could do. So you could specify, who you want to have as your approval, as your approver in order to allow it. So these are pre-deployments approvals. So if you set an approval, it will not deploy to this environment until you get the approvals. So coming back here, and then here we have our variable group. So our variable group is going to tell us what the configuration data is for creating this. So if we go look at this variable group, we can see we have it here. And it is going to give us the information that we need in order to deploy this resource. So the hosting plan, the location, the resource group name. We also need the subscription, and we need the web app name. So why is it important to have these things as a variable group? Well, because there could be secrets, and it's also a central place where you would add these things. But the other thing is, if you have a test QA through prod environment, you're going to have different values here. So you want to have a situation where the variables, the names of the variables stay the same across environments. It's just the values that will change. All right, so another thing is we have to tell it what the service connection is. Like, where is this deploying to? So we have a service connection here called IAC, and that's set up in our service connections and in our project settings. And if we go and edit this, we could see the details of it. We see that this is the subscription that's deploying to. We could scope it to a resource group, but we're not. And the service connection name. So that is what we are using when we go and deploy this. Now, coming down to our stages area, this is where we do our different stages. We have a build stage, and then we have a deployment stage. So if we had a test environment all the way through prod, there would be different stages here for each one of those environments. So if we go look at the build stage, you can actually view this template, and we see what the details are of how this is doing its build. So it's a job template, and we have tasks here that we can use to install Bicep and run Bicep. One thing that we need to understand is that, Bicep, you could do this through PowerShell like we did locally, but it's better to use built-in tasks in order to get this, because they're supported and it's more declarative. When we write PowerShell, we're now not declarative anymore. We're being imperative because we're writing details. So whenever you have a chance, it's good to use the out-of-the-box stuff. So I'm going to just remove this because it will just make it take longer to run. This is just spitting out the files on the build server. So here we have this Bicep build task, and this is going to do our builds. So one thing we're telling it to do is we want to build multiple things within a folder. And if we have a dozen Bicep files, this one task is going to build all of those that are in there and create separate JSON files. So we tell it multiple, we tell it what the source directory is. And that's the Bicep thing that we see up here. So that's where it's going to be. And we're telling it to output it to a drop folder, artifact staging directory called Bicep ARM. And so we'll be in that folder, and then we're going to publish it. So that's what the build is going to do, and that's what's going to make those JSON files available to us. So once we do the build, we now have the dev stage, and this dev stage, we can't, we can create a template for it, but since we have to pass in different values here, I decided to just leave it here. So we have this stage. It's a deployment stage, telling it what environment to use. And we're also telling it what variable group to use up here in order to get the values that we need. So what it's going to do is it's going to download the build artifacts that we created in the build stage, so that the JSON files will be available to us. And then we're going to do an Azure Resource Management template deployments task. This is for deploying JSON files. So the things that we say here is, what is the deployment scope? I think I should make this bigger. Surprised no one said. Is that better?
Yep.
So we have our deployment scope here, saying resource group. We have the service connection, which we're passing in as a variable up here. And we have the subscription ID, which is coming from the variable group, the resource group names from the variable group, location, the same thing. And we have all these other things, such as the parameters that we're going to be using. So we have to tell it also what is the ARM template name that we're going to be using. And that's set right here. It's going to be arm.json when we go and build this thing. So this is our definition. And what I'm going to do now, just to make sure that we have over here, we're going to deploy it to this one, I believe. So just make sure that nothing's in there. All right, so let's run this. And we're going to run it off of our feature branch. And we're going to do the build stage and then the dev. So running this in a pipeline gives us that ability to deploy across different environments that we won't personally have access to, by using the service connection for that environment. And it also allows us to do it in an automated way. So anytime somebody makes a change in their feature branch and they do a PR merge into their development branch, for example, this could go and deploy the resource to your dev environment automatically. So it's for a developer is creating infrastructure, just as a developer is doing .NET code, it makes it a whole lot easier to work. Your process is much easier. You don't have to worry about deploying things. You just have to worry about writing your code and making sure it works. All right, so the build has been done and the infrastructure is going to get deployed in the next step. So let's wait for that to happen. While we're doing that, let's go over here and see. So we have here what has been published by the build. We see our drop folder, we have our bicep ARM folder, and then we have our JSON folder. So even though it was a bicep file, we compiled it into a JSON ARM template. So here it's now deploying. Hopefully it works. It looks like it's okay because it hasn't failed yet. And this will take a minute or two. So you know where this is going. If it works, it's going to create the deployments through a pipeline. So any questions about any of this? Because we actually only have a couple minutes left. All right, so you can see here that it's it deployed. We're just waiting for the web app to show up. There we go. So we did that within a pipeline. And it's something that we have an historical a view of within our runs here. And we also, if we go to our environment, we could see that we just ran this now. So we have this this history of deployments to this environment, and we can go and take a look at it and go straight to the run within Azure Pipelines that environment was that instance of the deployment to that environment. So that's all I have. Any questions? Just got in time. I think we finished at 10:55. Has anybody used Bicep before or ARM templates?
I've used ARM templates before.
Okay. What do you think as far
Yeah,
as?
I mean, I was really,
Bicep?
I'm, like you said, they're a pain in the butt, right? It's very frustrating using them. So it seems like this is a lot easier. So I definitely want to explore it. So I definitely.
Yeah, especially if you do know ARM templates, it's a very easy learning curve. It's a very simple language. Because it's a domain-specific language, you actually know what to write because you're writing it as an ARM template, but just in a different syntax. All right, great. Well, it's 10:55. Thanks for coming. And if you have any questions, you can follow up with me. I think my information might be on the meeting description.
Thanks, Brian.
All right. Have a good
Appreciate it.
day.
You too. Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks, Brian.
Thank you. Bye.